So, hello everybody. Good afternoon. I think probably for most of you, although if you are joining from I suppose over in the Americas or other regions, then it's a good morning to you still, I guess. But welcome back, everyone, anyway, and yeah, welcome back to the second section of today's proceedings. So this morning we focused on WRC 23 and had a really fascinating session looking at some of the key priorities and key areas for that. And one of the issues that people identified as being one of the key areas is the C-band. So we're delighted now to have a session that's focusing specifically on that key band, the key spectrum there, and looking at kind of what to what extent the coexistence of satellites and mobile services is a reality in the 3.6 to 3.8 band. So really looking forward to this session. So we have an excellent lineup of speakers here to discuss the issues. Just before I introduce them, one thing I wanted to mention is the audience polls. So you've probably seen that we do have some polls running. We've had audience polls running throughout all of the sessions so far, and this one is no different. So for those of you who maybe are joining for the first time or who haven't seen those polls, you can find them on the right-hand side of your screen. So you need to click on the tab that says polls, and you will find two different questions that we'd like you to vote on, and we'll be bringing those responses and the answers that we get from those into the discussions later on in the session. So please do go and vote on those polls. So without further ado then, I would like to now bring up our moderator for this session, Hans Eel. Hans, hello there.
Hello.
This is from Nera Economic Consulting, and he's going to be moderating this afternoon session. So Hans, over to you, and looking forward to the discussions.
Great. Thank you, Dan. It's a great honor to be here today. Welcome everyone to this afternoon's session on the C-band. My name is Hans Eel. I'm an associate director with Nera Economic Consulting, and I work predominantly on spectrum auctions, spectrum pricing, and spectrum valuation, both for mobile operators, satellite operators, but also for regulators. Traditionally, the C-band has been used for fixed satellite services, and in particular in Africa, it plays a very important role. So there's limited terrestrial infrastructure, so a lot of companies, banks, and NGOs rely quite heavily on VSAT technology. It is also used for broadcasting. Its high resistance to rain fade means that it can be used to provide services with a very high degree of reliability. But many countries around the world are now clearing part of the band and making it available for mobile use. And the question is, what is the best way forward for Africa? Now, the title of the session is, to what extent is coexistence of satellite and mobile services a reality in 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz? I think there are two parts to this topic of coexistence in this band. The first one is a purely technical one. So we can work out what separation distances we need between satellite and mobile, given various mitigation measures such as power limits, filters, guard bands, and we can work out what those distances should be. In some less populated areas, we may be okay, we may be able to manage with those distances. However, the main benefit of using C-band for mobile is in the cities and densely populated areas where the spectrum can actually provide a massive capacity boost. So in this case, those separation distances may actually be a problem, and some hard policy decisions will need to be taken to prioritize the use of this band for one service or another. Now, around the world, regulators have started taking these decisions. So in Europe, the entire 3.4 to 3.8 has been or is going to be allocated for mobile. In the US, the FCC has adopted a plan to clear 3.7 to 3.98, have a 20 megahertz guard band, and then have a continued satellite use in 4 to 4.2 gigahertz. And it looks like Canada is going to follow the same sort of transition plan. Administrations in the Middle East and North Africa have decided that the entire 3.3 to 3.8 is key for 5G, and we're actually seeing commercial networks being deployed in this range there as well. In Asia Pacific, China and South Korea have been focusing on 3.4 to 3.7, and Australia has already allocated 3.6 to 3.8. These are just some examples to show you that there's a lot of focus on 3.6 to 3.8 and making it available for mobile across the world. Now, obviously the situation is quite different in Africa, and it will be interesting to see what the best way forward is in this region. We have an excellent panel here today to discuss this. Each panelist will make some introductory remarks first, and these will then be followed by an open discussion where the panel will address your questions. So please make sure you post them in the chat function. As Dan's mentioned, we've also got a number of polls, and we would be grateful if you could cast your vote in the poll section. Now on to our first speaker. We have Cesar Gutierrez Migueles, Head of Wireless Regulatory Policy for Africa at Huawei, here with us today. And Cesar will give us the mobile perspective on the 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz range. So over to you, Cesar.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Hans, and very good afternoon to all. I have to say I'm very happy to be here. Huawei has been a partner of the conference, of the Sub-Sahara Spectrum Conference, since the very beginning, and we certainly plan to continue. I think this conference are a fantastic way of sharing views in a way that it's perhaps gives us a bit more freedom and the possibility to be frank, a bit more than what we are normally used to for instance, in the APM or in the ITU conferences. So in that sense, I think it's a very valuable way of exchanging views. So I think it's been a very interesting conference so far, and I hope that this session is also of interest to everybody. We're going to start this with a few of our views on Huawei's views on the C-band, and in particular on this question about coexistence. So Dan, can I ask you to move to the next slide? Yes, thank you. So I think the first thing I wanted to say is that the C-band, it's the primary 5G band globally. So it is the band that a majority of administrations have chosen to deploy the first wave of 5G networks. So the chart here on the left shows that the C-band is at the bottom. So this chart is using the 3GPP terminology when it comes to bands. So the C-band is band N77, N78, and as we are today in September 2020, there are about 80 commercial networks deployed using the C-band. So it's more than the bands that are deployed in the rest of the frequencies altogether. So certainly, when it comes to the global outlook and the global picture, the C-band is the most popular band and the one that is being put into use. Now, the question that follows is which part of the C-band are we talking about in the different countries or regions? Because the C-band, well, it depends on who you speak to, but it can be considered like going from 3.4 to 4.2. So what you have on the right is what is the current situation in terms of the apportionment of this band between the two main uses, which is the incumbent use, the fixed satellite service, and now the introduction of the mobile services. So as you can see, different countries and different parts of the world have taken a different view on this. I would highlight at this point, as Hans mentioned before, the situation in the US, where the FCC is now looking at repurposing or refarming or migrating the block 3.7 to 4.0 from satellite services to mobile services. Again, different countries have different views on this, and I think that is also the situation in Africa. I think for those that were at the last APM 19, you would remember that we discussed the possibility to study the identification of 3638 for IMT, and I think the continent was pretty much split. If I remember correctly, we had the Southern Africa region, SADC, and East Africa and the North were keen to study this identification at the next WRC, at WRC23, whereas Central and West Africa, I believe, if I'm not wrong, those countries there didn't want to study this. So clearly, it's a situation. This is a band that where different countries have different views, and that also translates into Africa. So perhaps, and this is perhaps my first comment, and the point for reflection is that we may be in a situation where we cannot get a Pan-African harmonized view on this. And I think it is fair that countries that have an interest in introducing IMT are allowed to do so. And of course, countries that want to preserve the 3628 block for satellite services are of course allowed to do so and protected if they want to do so. From our perspective, certainly harmonization is much better, and we would like to see the whole of Africa moving as a whole, but perhaps this is a case where it would not be possible. Okay, Dan, can you move to the next one? Thank you. So then there is another point of contention here, which is how much spectrum do you need for mobile services in the C-band? And hence, that follows that whether you need to identify another block within the C-band for mobile services. So our view and our recommendation is that you will need large blocks per operator to deploy 5G in an efficient and spectrally efficient and also a cost-effective way. So just to be clear, this is a recommendation. Of course, there is no obligation on doing so. Technically speaking, you can certainly deploy 5G new radio in blocks of 50 megahertz, 40 megahertz, even blocks of 10 megahertz. Whether you would be any operator is going to do that, that is very doubtful. But what we're talking about here is a recommendation. So Luciana from the GSMA mentioned this morning, and from the perspective of Huawei, that's clearly the case. We recommend blocks of 80 or 100 megahertz per MNO. But just to be clear, this is not just industry pushing for some crazy number on some idea that we pull out of thin air. There is, if you look at the ITU documents, when the ITU started looking at IMT 2020, one of the requirements that were set was support for 100 megahertz. If you look at what policymakers and regulators in Europe are thinking, it's a similar situation, and there are recommendations about identifying 80 or 100 megahertz per MNO. And of course, the industry, we think so. So this is not a myth. This is not something that is just Huawei is come up with it without any substance behind. This is something that's agreed by the majority of regulators, policymakers, and of course by the industry. So I'm not getting here into the details of why technically it is more efficient to use large blocks and what are the benefits of using large blocks. It is, for instance, the capacity that you would extract from a 100 megahertz block is more than 2 times the one that you get from 50 megahertz. But there is plenty of there are documents that contain this evidence, and I would point to that, to the ECC report 287, for instance, which contains an annex that explains why large blocks are recommended. So that is one of the reasons why we think we in many places in Africa you will need more spectrum for 5G in this band. On the right, you have I compiled here a schematic view of the current assignments in a few African countries, and the thing to point out here is that the band. Sorry, the 3.4 to 3.6 is already quite busy. It's already licensed, and there is little scope for opening large blocks for 5G. So the current situation in many African countries is that it is very difficult within the existing IMT allocation to achieve large blocks. And then can you please move to my last slide, please? So now, specifically on the question of coexistence. So Hans mentioned at the beginning that there is the technical side of it, so which is the what separation distance you need to achieve coexistence. And there are plenty of studies that have looked at that. ITU have looked at that. They will continue to look at that in this cycle. The results are all over the place. Huawei has done real-life trials, and we have come with separation distances that are certainly much shorter than what the studies have shown. So there is this the question of the technical question of how far you have to go to ensure coexistence is something that actually, in our view, is best solved on a case-by-case basis on specific situations rather than relying on generic studies. Now, beyond the technical question, I think it's useful to consider the policy, the overall policy in this. And I think it helps to look at this from two angles. The first is which geographical area are we looking at? Is it urban, suburban, or is it rural? Bearing in mind that 5G will get deployed in urban areas primarily, urban and suburban areas primarily. So in terms of coexistence then, what we think is that it is possible to coexist. It's possible to coexist if the satellite services are in rural areas. It's possible to set up a buffer zone that separates the rural areas from the urban areas, and you would have 5G services in urban areas and preserve the satellite services in the rural areas. In urban areas, you could think about setting up exclusion zones, but the risk here is that those exclusion zones cover a large part of the city. So overall, that we think that national administrations, national regulators need to consider carefully in each area, this urban or suburban, and then they have to take a view on what of the services brings most value. And one option is possibly to consider 5G for the urban areas and satellite service in the rural areas. And I will finish with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Cesar. Really interesting presentation, and there are a lot of questions coming from this, which we'll hopefully get to in more detail in the panel session later. Now let's move on to our second speaker, Hazem Moakit. He's Vice President, Spectrum Strategy at Intelsat, and Haz will give us the satellites perspective on the 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz range. Haz, over to you.
Thank you, Hans. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate it. Again, my name is Hazem Moakit. I'm the Vice President of Spectrum Strategy at Intelsat, and I would like here to give you the perspective of the satellite industry on this matter, this very important matter. So if we can just go on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to address three topics here in this area. So we're going to first talk about the global landscape, nature of usage of C-band. Then we're going to talk about the economic realities, particularly from the point of view of Africa, and then to address perhaps some of the points that were brought up by Cesar. And then lastly, we'll talk about the compatibility between 5G and FSS. So we can go on to the next slide, please. So this summarizes here the outcome of WRC-19 and also a snapshot of some countries around the world. So obviously there's Agenda Item 1.3 for Region 1, and that talks about not identifying 3.6 to 3.8 for IMT, but only talks about elevating the status of mobile from secondary to primary. You can also see the difference here from one region to the next. You can also see there's no alignment really in terms of what each region is doing. And if we can go to the next slide, that perhaps will explain why this happens. So when you look at C-band and how C-band is used around the world from a satellite perspective, you'll see that it varies. There are regions where C-band is used for B2B and B2C, whereas there are some regions where it's strictly used for B2B, business to business. And then also the nature of reliance on C-band in some regions is different. For example, in Africa, you can't really land a plane in Africa without relying on a C-band satellite link. That is certainly not the case in other regions. So the dependency on C-band varies from one region to the next, and that leads also to the fragmented view of how C-band should be allocated. And this kind of brings up the point about harmonization. Harmonization is definitely great, but it can only be done to the extent that it's possible. You cannot force harmonization on every region when the realities on the grounds are different. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So this sort of now gives us the situation in Africa. This comes from the GSMA report in the mobile economy in Africa as of 2019. And what this basically tells us that up until 2025, 2G and 3G will still account for 85% of the connections in Africa. And then there are 800 million people in sub-Saharan Africa that do not use mobile broadband because of A, coverage, and B, affordability. So you have this reality of the mobile industry that they are really still when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, they're still at the 2G, 3G stage right now, even up to 2025. Meanwhile, satellite on the other side is providing critical services to Africa. It's providing cellular backhaul, enabling connectivity, providing critical communications for airlines. So that's the dynamic that we look at here. So if you can go on to the next slide. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah. So now I want to address this point about is really 100 megahertz is really needed, right? So obviously, more spectrum is always good. I mean, if I can have 200 instead of 100, that's better. If I can have 400 instead of 200, that's even better. So, but there is a reality to it. Like, is it really needed? Do you really need 100 megahertz to start 5G in the band spectrum? The reality is no. And to that point, Ofcom did a study, and the link is here at the bottom of the slide. Basically, they said that there's no evidence that you really need 100 megahertz to take advantage of the 5G benefits. That with 40 megahertz blocks, you are able to achieve the economic benefits of 5G. And going above that, yes, of course, it is better. It's always better to go from 40 to 60 to 70 to 80. But the reality is that it's really not necessary. And when you combine this with the fact that I presented in the prior slide, you start to wonder, is it really needed? So I leave that with you to think about. Moving on to the next slide, please. Another thing when you have to look at is balancing supply and demand when it comes to spectrum. So if you provide too much spectrum to the mobile industry, this may lead to, or to anybody, this would lead to inefficiency. It leads to oversupply, and it leads to spectrum being not fully utilized. And in the case of 5G, given the situation of the mobile industry, the mobile deployment in Africa, throwing too much spectrum right now in the mid-band spectrum is not going to really solve the problem. There is a coverage problem and there's an affordability problem. And what I can tell you technically is that C-band requires a lot of densification on the ground. It requires a lot of infrastructure costs. And in many cases, the business case for such deployment doesn't really exist. So this is a really key point for regulators to think about. Next slide, please. So these are just real to go through quickly. Mobile operators have options to deploy instead of C-band to deploy 5G. They can refarm existing spectrum. They should also consider sharing of spectrum among MNOs because that leads to more efficiency. Or they can use millimeter wave in highly densely populated areas. So next slide, please. Technical realities. Okay, is it really compatible? Can they be really made compatible? The long and the short of it is no, not really. You can make everything work together, but it can be very painful. And what I can point to is statements made by the mobile industry in the US proceeding, the US C-band proceeding, where they clearly said that their preference is to eject FSS out of the band because it's the coexistence conditions are going to be too onerous. You're going to have a lot of exclusion zones. You're going to have a lot of difficulty in coexisting, and because of that, the preference is actually to separate them so that you don't put them in the same band. So if we can go on to the next slide, I'll talk quickly about the dynamics. So by definition, by definition, the satellite signals are very, very weak. You know, they come from 36,000 kilometers up in the sky, and you have 5G signals that are being transmitted from a couple of kilometers away from you. So there are two interference mechanisms that are at play here: saturation of the front end receiver of the satellite earth station, and then you have out of band emission issues. So these two interference mechanisms lead to excessive interference on the satellite earth station. So that makes the coexistence really practically impossible. For example, if you think about it, this is, and then just to give you an analogy, this is very similar to trying to put a child to sleep in a room while you have somebody playing very loud music in the next room. This is exactly the analogy. So you have 5G, it's very powerful, and then next to it, there's a satellite signal that's very weak. So this compatibility issue has to be addressed. We can go on to the next slide, please. So just to wrap up with my final thoughts. So we need to balance the realities of 5G. So 5G brings a lot of promise. We're not denying that. There is a lot of good things that 5G brings, but this has to be balanced against the reality on the ground. What are we using C-band for right now, and what is 5G is going to present? C-band and the FSS continues to provide critical services for Africa. Like I said, air traffic control signals that are transmitted throughout Africa in C-band. And then, so in this case, taking C-band away from a service that is already providing economic value to put it in the hands of MNOs that may not have the right business case for it is not really the wisest thing to do. So, again, harmonization works to the extent that it's possible, but you can't really force harmonization from other regions when the dynamics on the ground are very different. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Has. Really interesting. You made some really good points on Africa's dependence on C-band satellite services, as well as the bandwidth that mobile operators may need in the band. I hope we can pick this up again in the panel discussion later, because obviously your views contrast with what we've heard from Zeza earlier. But let's keep the momentum going. Now, our third speaker is Basebi Musinyi. Basebi is Deputy Director of Spectrum Management at the Botswana Communications Regulatory Authority. She'll provide us with the regulator's perspective on the C-band, highlighting the competing demands for the spectrum, and also her views on the services that should use this band. So over to you, Basebi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for allowing me to speak on what I think of the C-band regarding Africa. Next slide, please. Right. I think I would want to take a different approach to this. But the main question is, can FSS and mobile service coexist in the C-band? My simple question is, or answer is, I think so. But then I pose the question to say, is that the critical question for Africa? Is this what we should be asking as in terms of the continent? Then I think as Africa, what the critical question should be
is how we balance the two services, being the satellite service and the mobile service. And of course, today, as we deal with the C-band, in particular, the C-band. For me, coexistence is not a challenge, because as in terms of us being engineers and having dealt with the studies, I think solutions can be hatched. But for Africa, I think we must be asking a question: can we balance the two services, which I think to me are quite critical in Africa? Next slide, please. Having said that, I want to bring it to this conference today to say it is Africa during WRC 19 that brought a proposal to say we would like Africa to be able to be allowed, or any other places or any other countries that are developing, to pool their resources together to be able to play in the space of satellite. And this, at least I must say, we were able to get something in the positive. And this, we called it the extended resolution, to ensure that countries can be able to pool their resources together to be able to probably maybe even launch satellite and have one administration being the one that will be used as a filing administration. I must say, as Africa, we saw this as an opportunity that we can be able then to play in this space. And to the effect that, for the fact that this was favorably considered in WRC, SADC as a region has been able to come up with an initiative of shared satellite framework, which is now under development. Now, what am I trying to say? Next slide, please. I'm trying to say, as regulators or as Africans, we should look at this question differently, in that we have already in 2007 been able at least to allocate spectrum from 3.4 to 3.6 to the mobile service. So are we saying we still want to give more to the same service? So mine is just to say we should be able to balance this very two critical services to Africa. We know very well that in March last year, the Southern Hemisphere, or southern part of Africa, got one of the intense tropical cyclones named Cyclone Idai, which was one of the most destructive. And we know that with that cyclone, it was the satellite service that was used by the countries in the region to be able to rescue and trace the people that needed to be rescued. So much as this has been one, or it doesn't often happen, but it has happened. And we know that the terrestrial systems were quite overwhelmed, to the effect that some countries had to even, talk to ITU for ITU to be able to assist us in terms of sending some satellite terminals for them to be able to communicate and to effect the rescue mission. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, it could be that technically it is feasible. It could be that it can be done. But as Africa, we should look at it differently, in that we still do not have mature terrestrial systems to be able to do what needs be in terms of disasters. Next slide, please, and the last. And therefore, I can say that as Africa, and having grown in the issues of satellites, as evidenced by us being able at least to get a favorable finding from the WRC 19 Agenda Item 7 Issue E, we should then be careful as we look at this issue not to shoot ourselves on the foot by going against what we already have gotten the milestone for with regards to satellite service. So for me, I would say the critical question is not whether FSS or satellite and mobile could coexist in the C-band, but rather that Africa should critically evaluate the need for the two services, and if possible, use other bands for mobile rather than the C-band, as we know that C-band is still the band that Africa uses for very critical service. So this is the way I think we should be looking at in Africa, and also for the fact that we have really made progress in terms of understanding the issues, in terms of capacity building, is in terms of even having initiatives where we would want to build our own satellites. I would put Nigeria as one of the countries that have been able to, work in this space. Angola as well in SADC. We know very much about Intelsat. So I think as Africa, we should push as a region, not as to whether you are in the region where probably maybe you don't have a lot of rainfall like the SADC, but rather to push as a region to be able to harness what satellite as an industry can be able to bring to us, because I want to believe we have done much as in terms of the mobile service. So that is my 2 cents on the issue, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Basabi, for this fascinating presentation. What you're proposing is quite radical, but clearly something needs to be done to connect the unconnected. And I hope we can come back to some of the points that you've made in the panel discussion later. Now let's move on to our 4th speaker, Jerome Lewis. Jerome is the Director of the Engineering Department at the Information and Communication Technologies Authority of Mauritius. And Jerome will give us an overview of the situation in Mauritius and discuss some of the challenges of coexistence in the 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz range. Jerome, over to you. I'm looking forward to your introductory comments.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Hans. Hi to everyone. So basically, my presentation will give you the case of Mauritius. Mauritius being a small island in the Indian Ocean. Next slide, please. So we'll have a look very briefly at a few facts about Mauritius and what are the C-band allocations and usage here. The critical applications, the demand for 5G spectrum, and our thoughts with regard to the coexistence and how we sort of are thinking now to move ahead in this subject matter. Next slide, please. So very briefly, Mauritius is a number of islands, basically, the main island being Mauritius. And we have an EEZ area of around 2.3 million square kilometers, which is quite wide. We have 3 mobile operators and a mobile penetration of almost 150%. And the different bands that we use, 900, 1800, 2.1 gigahertz, 2.6 gigahertz, 3.5, is currently in the test for 5G, and 800 megahertz is also in the test for 4G. Next slide, please. So we have been using the 3.4 to 3.6 gigahertz band since around the year 2005, at the time WiMAX was starting. So it has been used for a while for deployment of that technology, and then it stopped. But the band is available now. Of course, we will have to tweak certain regulatory parameters to allow 5G, but otherwise the band is available. The 3.6 to 4.2 is, of course, for fixed satellite service. We currently have 10 Earth stations in operation in C-band, 5 of which have their downlink in the 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz band. Next slide, please. So critical applications. So there are indeed critical applications. I think the previous speakers talked about this. The civil aviation of Mauritius is part of the SADC VSAT-2 network, which is operational since 2007. And this network is essential for us as it provides air traffic movement safety. Next slide. And also one other critical application is with regard to connecting remote islands. So as I said, we are a number of islands, and one of them is Agalega, which is up north, very close to Seychelles. And the only way we can connect to that island is through C-band connectivity. And in fact, this is a USF finance project. And also C-band is used as a backup to link the island of Rodrigues, which is at the off the east coast of Mauritius. Next slide. So definitely there is a demand for spectrum in C-band. And we are very much aware, and the operators also have noted that with the 3.4 to 3.6, we only have 200 megahertz available. I understand that there is a debate now with regard to whether 100 megahertz is necessary or not, but indeed the operators have made their representations that they would need at least 100 megahertz of contiguous spectrum per operator. So if this is the case with 3 mobile operators, there is clearly a scarcity of spectrum, so we will have to sort this out. We're still thinking about how to move ahead. Next slide. So in terms of interoperability, I think this was mentioned. We're talking about out-of-band emission and LNB saturation. I'm just mentioning, I know that there has been several studies carried out over the years. One of the latest I've just read, which I wanted to share, was published in March this year. And they give figures of distance separation for out-of-band emission. What they say is that base station located within 60 kilometers of a Earth station receiver, even not aligned with the Earth station antenna pointing, can cause interference. LNB saturation can be avoided through interference avoidance techniques. We're talking about filters and so on, of course. But they talk also about active antenna systems, which can also help reduce interference by direct beam steering towards the user terminal locations. Next slide. And in the uplink scenario, what they found is that a user terminal may cause harmful interference to the base station through out-of-band emissions when located within one kilometer, and a single user terminal may saturate the LNB when located in a distance of 550 meters. So all these together with other studies and also in terms of measurements, which we plan to carry out, will help us to make our decisions. Next slide. So as I said, our operators are in the process of testing 5G in the C-band, and we will be also conducting measurements to verify and see what the situation is exactly. Next slide. So we are also considering alternative frequency bands, which have comparable propagation characteristics, like the N79 5G band, which is 4.4 to 4.5 gigahertz band, and also the 2.5 to 2.690 gigahertz bands, which is the N41. So then we can, with those two bands, get an additional of 290 megahertz, which can also be assigned to operators in case we cannot do this in the C-band. So next slide. I think that was my last slide. So thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome. Really, really good presentation, and shows the difficulty of achieving coexistence between the two services in this band. I think your last slide are really interesting as well. I mean, there are alternatives as well. The 2.5 in particular could provide similar bandwidth. So that's really good. Now, thank you again to the entire panel for their introductory remarks and their very contrasting views on how the C-band should be used. Now, let's bring them all back. They're already back. Very good. And we've got lots of questions coming in, and especially while you were speaking as well. So let's address some of them now. The first question here from Abdullah Antikba: satellite can provide connectivity for rural broadband. However, the satellite is not affordable. How can the satellite operators reduce the price of satellite services? I think that's a question for Has.
Sure. So thank you for the question. I appreciate it. in terms of affordability of satellites, I think you need to look at some of the newer generations of satellites. So the newer satellites that are high throughput satellites that employ digital processing have brought the cost significantly down. Now, I think what you also need to look at is that in this case, C-band is not used in a B2C configuration, but it's used in a B2B configurations, meaning it's used for cellular backhaul, it's used for network connections. So the affordability element, if you are trying to look at using C-band to provide connectivity to an individual, then perhaps that is not the right metric. What you need to look at is what satellite is used for in terms of allowing mobile companies to provide services in areas that are very remote and inaccessible. Also, you have to look at that satellite is used to provide critical communications. So I think it's important to put the product in its right box and what it's really meant to be used for. You know, it's not meant for somebody to put an antenna on top of their house to get connectivity. It is meant to provide services in a B2B. Now, in a B2C configuration, satellite is used for media distribution. Often, a lot of folks in some countries have C-band dishes to receive their TV signals. So I think that it's important to set the comparison in the right domain to be fair.
Thank you, Haz. Does anyone else want to add to Haz's already very comprehensive answer? Okay, should we move on to the next question? Oh, Jerome? Oh, no. Okay, right. Question 3 from Bashir Patel. Why can mobile not refarm and look at other mid-bands rather than displace millions of users like other countries are doing on 2.3, 2.6, and 3.5 gigahertz? I'd like Cesar to have a first stab at this question.
Yes, thank you, Hans. So I think, yes, that's the point that gets raised quite often, and I would say 2 things. First is that those bands that Bashir mentioned and other mobile bands are in many places are already being used. It can be by mobile operators, it can be by wireless internet service providers. They are licensed in many places. So the regulator and the national authority has a decision to be taken. Should I remove these licenses to make up for large blocks for MNOs to provide 5G, or do these licenses actually provide good services that I want to preserve? So I think it's not in the same way that satellite claims to be using the C-band heavily. The fact is that the existing mobile bands in many places are already heavily used as well. So that's my first point. And second point is that if I can remind you of the chart that I showed on my first my first slide, the C-band is by large the most popular 5G band globally. So certainly you could use other bands for 5G, and I expect certain African countries will use other bands for 5G, but in terms of ecosystem, in terms of take-up, the C-band is by a large margin the most popular bands. So if you cannot access the C-band for 5G, yes, by all means, look at different bands. But if you can access the 5G, the C-band, then you will definitely want to do that. And then it becomes a question of whether satellite services are more valuable in the C-band or not. Thank you.
I see Haz would like to respond to that. Haz, if you bear with me for a second, I'd like to bring in Jerome first, because Jerome also mentioned the 2.6 gigahertz band in his presentation. Yeah.
Well, indeed. Well, the 2.6 also has been open here in Mauritius for a while, and currently it's being used for 4G. However, in my presentation, what I said is that, at least for us, the 2.5 gigahertz band is split between FDD and TDD. And what we may have to do is actually have the whole band TDD, so that it can be a replacement or an alternative band correct alternative band for the 3.5 gigahertz band. But well, I think that should be okay. Well, until we wait until the millimeter wave bands really becomes a reality, at least for the time being, 2.5 and 3.5 should make a good combination to my mind.
Okay, thank you. And Has.
Yes, I mean, I fully agree with Jerome. I mean, there's the 2.6 gigahertz band that can be used. There's the 3.4 to 3.6. I mean, to the notion that the 3.4 to 3.6 is fragmented or has been used by WiMAX. So we don't want to clean up this mess. So let's just go and take C-band away from satellites who are providing a critical service right now, who are contributing to the economy. Take that away from them because it's too hard for us to go clean up the 3.4 to 3.6. I mean, this is the argument that I find, that the mobile industry brings up, which I find extremely, strange, I would say, because, why would you not clean up this 3.4 to 3.6 gigahertz band? It has been identified for IMT for so long. It can certainly be used, And I also go back to the point about what is the status of the mobile industry. There was one of the questions that was brought up. That why can't Africa catch up with the rest of the world? Absolutely. The objective here is not to prevent Africa from catching up, but the reality is that there is a coverage problem, and this is out of the GSMA report. There's a coverage problem, and there is a usage problem. So the coverage problem is that the networks right now, the mobile networks, in terms of being able to deploy everywhere, they have infrastructure challenge because it's the size of the continent, because of the way the population is distributed in Africa. It makes it very difficult to reach out to everybody. So, and when you compound this with the fact that C-band requires densification, which means it requires more towers, requires fiber to the towers, requires connecting to all these issues, then how is the business case going to close when you have an affordability issue because people continue to rely on 2G services because of the price of the handset? So absolutely, if you can go 5G and make the business case close, by all means. But the reality is that throwing spectrum at the mobile industry while their business cases are not closing, they're not going to go and spend on deploying. So we need to be realistic. We can't just start building the 5th floor when the 2nd floor is still being built up. So that is the point that we need to be cognizant of. So.
Okay, I think this is a really good segue into that next question here from Bashir Gwandu. Do we as Africa really want to remain in that 2G, 3G stage by 2025? Why should Africa not try and be like others? I know for a fact that Nigeria wants to have 4G full coverage by 2025. Should other countries not aspire to be better? Maybe a question for the two regulators on the panel. Jerome or Basabi, who would like to go first?
Okay, I would say for me, it's not a question of competition. It's not a question of catching up with others. I think for us is to look at our needs as Africa. What are our needs at this time and point, and plan going forward, rather than having to look at it as in, the world is going this way, so we must go that way. Because for all that I know, is that even other regions, when they do this, they cater for their needs. Mm-hmm. They look at what they need, and then they decide on how they go about it. So I think with Africa, we should do the same. We shouldn't be kind of playing catch up or kind of saying, competing with whoever had made their decisions based on whatever is there for them. For that is why I'm saying, as Africa, from where I'm sitting, there's a lot that we can still do in that space. In that, we have also been able to say, let us be able to play in this space. So if now we close it up altogether, then what are we saying as a region? So that's why I'm saying, even as in terms of the WRC 23, Africa did not have a consensus on this issue as to whether it should be part of the WRC 23. So what I'm just saying is we should move as a bloc to accommodate those African countries that experience a lot of torrential rainfall and use C-band as a means of effecting whatever that effect that is good to them. So for me, it's let's try to move together as Africa to be able to do what is good for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sure. Well, I tend to agree with what Basabi is saying. As a regulator, we always need to have a balancing. There's a balancing act that has to be done all the time, and we cannot sort of take into consideration only one part of the industry. We have to sort of take into account the full spectrum of what the industry says. And as I said in my presentation, C-band today, we can't do without it, especially for civil aviation applications. So we, my civil aviation department will not agree, I'm sure, if we were to sort of refarm, or they will be worried. So definitely we have to balance things. And as I said, there are always solutions that can be found. And we've done that in different situations as well, when we had to open up for 4G, etc. The good thing about technology today is that you have so many frequency bands that a technology can work on, and thanks to how the technology is designed, and many frequency bands have very similar propagation characteristics. So the thing is that, of course, there is a question of there's some question of economics also, which goes into that. But be it as it may, my point is that we can always find a way around and to be able to satisfy the demand both of the satellite industry as well as the mobile industry. That's basically what I think. Yeah.
If I just may add one thing,
I would like to bring in Cesar, because I think he's been wanting to respond.
Sure.
Cesar, what is your view on that question?
So I think I certainly agree that you have to balance the needs of different industries. There's no doubt about that. I think that, however, I think the overarching concern is which is the best use of a particular band for your citizens and consumers. So that, in many cases, certainly leads to balancing, no doubt. Now, in the particular context of the C-band, I think I would just remind that the current situation is one where there are 200 megahertz identified for mobile and 600 megahertz identified for satellite services. So my question is, well, do you think, or don't you think that the satellite services could be provided with a smaller block than it is currently assigned, which is exactly the same question that the FCC asked themselves in the US. So I think, and the outcome of the US shows that yes, that is possible. And what happened is that satellite companies very quickly went on to procure satellites that would provide the capacity in the remaining spectrum. So that is something that is feasible. And again, so the question is, well, is the current balance the right balance, taking into account the needs of the populations and taking into account how can you provide 5G within the C-band? So I know that this question about the bandwidth per operator is heavily disputed by the satellite industry, but again, that is what operators would like to have. That's what operators think is the best way of providing the services. So I would recommend that you go and listen to your operators. If they tell you that they're happy with 40 megahertz or 10 megahertz, by all means, keep the existing allocation. But I think it's at the end of the day, the operators know what they need to provide the services. So I would recommend listening to them. And again, I think in terms of balance, our view is that the current allocation is not precisely balanced. It's quite the opposite. Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, so I can speak actually from experience on the US process because of the C-band clearing. And I think if we can put the second slide with the frequency allocations around the world, they can tell you. It speaks to the points brought up by the CB and Jerome, which is that every region is different. When you look at why the US did what it did, it's because the bottom part of C-band was allocated to the Department of Defense. You see, the 3.4 to 3.7 has been allocated and is still allocated to the U.S. Department of Defense, right? And then the best that they could do was to allow another type of mobile service, but a much reduced power in what they call the CBRS band in the 3.55 to 3.7. You see, so and then what this forced them to look at the FSS that is traditionally used by satellites in the U.S., which is 3.7 to 4.2. And I can tell you that the process was extremely onerous because it's going to involve launching 14 satellites to squeeze the capacity that is currently being used by these 500 megahertz into 200 megahertz. So, so the situation in the U.S. is different. You certainly cannot just import that into other regions. And by the way, in the U.S., C-band is really the backbone of media distribution. So it's used very little for connectivity. It's primarily used for media distribution. You look at Europe, for example. There's very thin use of C-band in Europe. It's only limited to B2B into large airports. So when they say we're going to allocate 400 megahertz to the mobile, it makes sense. Same thing in parts of North Africa and the Middle East. But we can certainly import that into South America, for example. In South America, media distribution in C-band is really critical. You take it away from C-band, from FSS, then how are you going to get all these football games to everybody in the whole continent, right? So this is to the point that was brought by the CB. You can't just simply copy other people because every region is different. You have to look at your own needs and what you have to do. And even in the case of repurposing, what happened in the US, look at very interesting point. The spectrum that was allocated for MNOs for licensing, for licensed spectrum in the C-band is 280 megahertz, right? This is what has been allocated in the US, in a country of 300 million people, right? With very high 4G penetration. So don't look at the range, look at the amount, right? So in Africa, if you have 3.4 to 3.6, that's 200 megahertz. And even if you consider going to 3.7, that's 300 megahertz, okay? That's on par with what's being done in the US. Look at what Germany auctioned. Germany auctioned 3.4 to 3.7, right? Again, 300 megahertz. So you look at the amount of spectrum that's being put in there. Don't be too caught up with the exact frequency range. You look at what's being put on the table, right? And if it's comparable spectrum. In some cases, if you have access to the 2.6 gigahertz spectrum, that's excellent. That does the job. So I think this issue that has to be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you, Has. I think this is a great sort of segue into the polls, because I think the contrasting views here on the panel are sort of reflected in the results there as well. Let's go to that second poll first. So how strongly should C-band satellite services be protected from 5G interference? 43% said all satellite services should be protected, even if this means lower quality and less affordable 5G services. 7% say protection for telecommunication users only, so TT&C. 14% said if a few domestic receivers suffer, that is acceptable. 4% say 5G takes precedence in urban areas, and 32% say that bands should be cleared for mobile use as much as possible. So again, we have these sort of contrasting views. Maybe Basabi or Jerome, would you like to comment on that, because this is sort of a regulatory question, and there's very different views across the region.
Well, definitely. I mean, this is exactly what you said. So the contrasting views, I think everyone is sort of defending their beliefs, and this is probably what results into this contrast. But I think at the end of the day, everyone understands that the decisions to be taken with regard to this frequency band is critical, at least in our region, in the African region, and we have to be very careful before really taking final decisions about what to do with our bands. And also, I think what has come up is that different regions have different ways to look at it. But what is important for us is we still need interoperability between countries, and we cannot say that one country can decide to do this and another country decides differently. We really have to coordinate our actions there. Yeah, so maybe Vasavi has more to say.
Well, I can say you've rightly summed it. However, I can see that there is another question, which maybe if you allow me to take, which is from Elizabeth. Do you see?
Sure. Can we just hold that for a moment and go to the second poll result and then come back to that question, Elizabeth, if that's okay with you? Okay. The second poll here was on mitigation and who should pay. So if mitigations are necessary to enable coexistence of satellite and mobile, who should pay? 56% say the mobile operators, 26% say regulators or government, 10% say those receiving C-band satellite services, and 8% say the satellite companies or broadcasters. Now, I don't need to ask Haz what his opinion is on the result, so I'm gonna ask Cesar what he thinks, and where he thinks it's fair that mobile operators should pay for mitigation. So, I mean, that's sort of the majority result here, at least.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's a very interesting question. And the first thing I would react is who should pay to whom? So who's going to receive the payments? So it is easy, well, one thing that simplifies that question is to know who is using the spectrum. And that the only way you can do and you can achieve that is if you have licenses. Now, if a lot of this use doesn't have license or should have a license and people don't apply for one, then it's going to be very difficult to pay them, to identify them and to pay them what should be, whatever the authorities concluded should be paid. So that's one first point. The other point, trying to perhaps answer the question is, well, what are the legitimate expectations? If you have a license that tells you that you can operate your Earth station for 10 years, and then the regulator comes in 1 year into the life of the license and tells you that you're going to stop using that spectrum tomorrow, then your legitimate expectation is to continue using that spectrum for 10 years. So I think it's probably justified that some sort of payment is given to you because you made your business plans. You install a very expensive antenna and a very expensive equipment, and now you're being told that next year that all that goes off. So I think in that case it's justified. Now, if the regulator comes to you on year 9, then perhaps, well, your equipment is depreciated, your business case has been done, so why should you receive any payment? So I think it's a rather difficult question. I think it's perhaps for regulators to consider whether they want to start organizing payments to people that get their licenses revoked. I think most of the regulators across the world will tell you they don't want to get anywhere near that situation. It's a nightmare. It's opening Pandora's box. So I think that generally speaking, it's a question we all have to understand that nobody owns the spectrum, and then the regulators have the very difficult task of deciding which is the best use. And sometimes, well, you're being told that you have to stop using that spectrum, and you will have to adapt your business to that. So generally speaking, if you have to give you a short answer, I don't think that kind of compensation for mitigation is something that regulators should do, and I'm pretty sure they don't want to get involved into that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Cesar. Yes, very, very brief, and then I'd like to get back to Elizabeth's question as a final one that we're going to be addressing here. So.
Yeah, in fact, it's two issues. I mean, because Elizabeth talks about, is it really possible? And like I was saying in my presentation, the The reality is that because we are knee deep with this process in the U.S., we have done tremendous amount of testing. Coexistence, of course, you can make anything work, but it's extremely difficult, and you can't really do it without knowing exactly where the earth stations are, without knowing the power levels, without managing. To Jerome's point, you have to use the radios to know the power in the direction of the earth stations. This is even in the case when 5G operates adjacent to satellite. So it's that sensitive, So and countries have adopted different approaches. And then we can talk forever about this. Countries like, for example, in Hong Kong, they have assigned 100 megahertz guard band. There's a notion of a guard band between 5G and FSS, and that size of the guard band is elastic depending on what measures you take. In the US, we were able to squeeze it to 20 megahertz because we knew exactly where the earth stations are. The FCC defined PFD levels that have to be met in the direction of the earth stations. So many specifics, including that every earth station has to be fitted with a bandpass filter. So all of these things have to be taken place. You take a situation like Hong Kong, where they have a lot of B2C, a lot of people receiving C-band signals for their TV reception. 20 megahertz didn't cut it. They have to have 100 megahertz, separation. So that is something that have to be looked at. Now, in terms of cost, I agree with Cesar. It's very difficult, but the reality is that if you have a user of spectrum and it was operating on a license exempt situation, right? There's that expectation that it's license exempt. You can't suddenly turn on and say, well, you were never really meant to be here, and then therefore you never have a license. Well, the expectation is that the use of that band did not require a license. So you can't just turn on his head and then blame the user for being in this license exempt situation. That was the nature of the allocation of the band. But it's a valid point that once you want to go into a compensation scheme, you have to account for every earth station, whether through registration. I wouldn't call it a license, but you have to register all the earth stations, know where they are, know who the operators are, and go through a very lengthy process of documentation in order to know who the users are, right? And then again, you go through a process of bidding, who gets compensated and what is the nature of a compensation. And it's not money. It's like you get a voucher to get a filter to be protected, whatever the case may be. But it is not an easy situation. And like I said, we are going through it right now in the US, and it's a very lengthy, very technical process that you have to consider. So.
Thank you, Haz. So we've got 1 minute left before we need to wrap it all up. Now, final question from Elizabeth Miguala. Is there anyone on the panel who can help us answer the session question? To what extent is coexistence of spectrum and mobile service a reality in the 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz range? Haz, you've already provided your views. I'd like to ask Basabi to give her views.
Well, I think the other colleague has extensively covered it, but I can say that I think for the fact that this is an agenda item that is on the table for WRC 15, probably we shouldn't prejudge the outcome of the studies that are currently ongoing. So let us wait and see how it turns up to be, and then we will make decisions based on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Basabi. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you very much for your insightful views. It was really a great pleasure to have you all today. And back to Dan, I suppose.
Thank you, Hans. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the panelists as well. I think that was a really interesting discussion, and I think you could see by the number of comments and questions we had coming in from the floor how engaged people were with that. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to everyone out there as well for all your comments and questions. And as I said, I saw there was some very lively discussion going on in the chat room there. So yeah, no, thank you all for that. And yeah, I think it was a really interesting discussion, as I said. So we got through quite a few of the questions, but I am conscious that we didn't manage to get through all of them. There were quite a few coming up there. So So now is your opportunity. If your question wasn't asked, or even if your question was asked and you want to maybe come back or expand a little bit more on the questions or make any more comments, it's now your turn to get involved. So in a second, I'm going to invite you all to head over to the Have Your Say area of the platform. So you can find that on the left-hand menu bar. I think it's the third icon down, if I'm remembering correctly. You'll see it says Have Your Say. So we're all now going to make our way over there, and that'll be your opportunity to have to request for your video and audio feed to be brought live. So you will be able to click the button to request your video to be brought live. Hans, I know, is going to be joining us as a moderator, and is going to be joined as well by Kezius. Kezius Mwale is going to be a second moderator as well. So Hans and Kezius will both be there and ready to discuss with you your opinion on things. So please do come through now into the Have Your Say area. And as I said, if you want to come and have your say as the session describes, then you can do that by bringing your audio and your video feed live. So I'm going to make my way over there now, and if any of the panelists want to come and join us for that as well, then we'd love you to be with us for that too. So thank you all again to our panelists. Thank you to Hans. Thank you to everyone out there, and we will see you in the Have Your Say area in just a minute or so. Thank you very much.